Lorie Chavez Durmer leaned into the mic, her voice dripping with mock civility, the kind of tone that smiles while it sneers. "Maybe if you focused less on your hair and more on your job, Congresswoman, we'd get somewhere." The room froze. Papers stopped rustling, eyes darted. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to keep rolling. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her hand stayed still. Her expression didn't crack. Only her eyes moved calm, deliberate, focused. The kind of look that says, "You just made a mistake." Durmer smirked, convinced she'd scored a point. It was the smirk of someone too used to applause, too certain that cruelty would land as confidence. A faint chuckle from her side of the aisle broke the silence, nervous, complicit. But it didn't last long. Because silence, when it belongs to the right person, carries more power than any insult. For Jasmine, this wasn't new. She'd heard worse in courtrooms, on campaign trails, in backroom whispers about who didn't belong. But she'd learned something long ago, that the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes strength is measured by how still you can stand while others unravel. The camera caught it that split second when her composure became the story. Commentators would later replay it in slow motion, frame by frame, like a scene from a political thriller. The audience didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything shifted. Not because of the insult, but because of the silence that followed it. And in that silence, Durmer's confidence began to crumble. The smirk wavered. The certainty faltered. Somewhere deep inside, she realized she'd crossed into unfamiliar territory, a battle she couldn't win with words meant to wound. The crowd didn't need a speech to understand what had just happened. The tables were already turning. Jasmine lifted her eyes, leaned forward slightly, and with a voice steady as steel said nothing at all. Not yet. But no one expected what came next. 3 questions that would turn the entire hearing upside down. Hours earlier, the hearing room had hummed with the low drone of routine politics, papers shuffling, microphones clicking, aides whispering last-minute notes. It was one of those long procedural afternoons that Washington produces in abundance. The topic sounded dry on paper: oversight of federal spending in underserved communities. But beneath the jargon, the tension pulsed. Everyone knew this wasn't just about numbers. It was about identity, representation, and who gets to decide whose voices matter. Lorie Chavez Durmer walked in with a purpose that wasn't about policy. Her heels struck the floor like punctuation marks, her expression fixed somewhere between smug and sanctimonious. She'd been briefed this was her chance to make a statement, to generate a viral clip for her base. Every gesture was calculated, the folders arranged just so, the rehearsed indignation. She scanned the room and smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her notes without looking up. Calm, centered, methodical, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. Where Durmer's presence screamed performance, Crockett's radiated quiet authority. She wasn't there for the spectacle. She was there for the substance. Years in law had taught her the rhythm of patience that truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply waits its turn. The witnesses began their statements. Charts were presented, questions asked. Cameras panned slowly across the committee dais. And yet, under that sterile hum, there was electricity, the kind that makes everyone lean in just a little more than usual. Staffers sensed it. Reporters, too. They'd seen the pre-hearing tension, the pointed exchanges in the hallway, the subtle jabs on social media the night before. Something was coming. Durmer leaned back in her chair, half listening, half performing. Her pen tapped impatiently against the folder. Every now and then, she shot glances at the audience, measuring her impact before the show even began. To her, this was theater. To Jasmine, it was duty. And that difference was about to matter. Crockett's eyes flicked briefly toward Durmer. Not in challenge, but in quiet understanding, the kind of look that says, "I know exactly who you are and exactly what you're about to do." She'd seen that look before, the confidence of someone mistaking cruelty for strength. The kind of arrogance that underestimates silence until it's too late. When the chair recognized Durmer for her questioning time, the mood in the room subtly shifted. Aides leaned forward, cameras focused tighter. Even the ambient noise seemed to dim. Durmer smiled, slow and deliberate, before leaning toward her microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Chair," she began, her tone dripping with performative politeness. "I just have a few questions about accountability." She emphasized the last word like a warning. On the opposite side, Crockett clasped her pen, eyes forward, shoulders square. No reaction. Just focus. She'd been through this kind of ambush before, the loaded phrasing, the baiting tactics, the coded insults that said more about the attacker than the target. What no one knew, not even Durmer, was that Crockett had been waiting for this moment. Not to defend herself, but to expose something deeper, the rot that hides beneath smug confidence, the weakness behind mockery, the fragility of power built on derision. The stage was set. The hearing had become a powder keg disguised as a policy meeting. One spark, one insult, and it would ignite. And when it did, Jasmine Crockett wouldn't raise her voice. She wouldn't shout. She'd do something far more devastating. She'd start asking questions. Lorie Chavez Durmer didn't just take her turn, she seized it. The moment her microphone light blinked red, her entire posture shifted, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for this stage. Her voice cut through the air with the crisp sharpness of someone who'd practiced in front of a mirror, every word shaped for performance, not truth. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, letting the name linger in the air a little too long. "Perhaps you can explain why your committee seems more interested in social media moments than in actual legislation." A few chuckles broke out behind her, the orchestrated kind. Too perfectly timed to be spontaneous. Durmer smiled, basking in them. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes flicking toward the cameras. This wasn't about governance. It was about optics. Every syllable was a calculated jab, a viral clip in the making. Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. Her hands rested on the desk, still, measured, waiting. Durmer continued, her words coated in sugar and venom. "You see, some of us are here to serve the American people, not ourselves." Her voice lifted, rhythmic, practiced a sermon of self-righteousness. She looked around the room for approval, and when she found it lacking, she filled the silence with another smile, wide and empty. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Every question was a trap disguised as decorum, every phrase an echo of old, familiar dog whistles. When she spoke of professionalism, her tone hardened on the syllables, turning the word into an accusation. When she invoked decency, she meant obedience. When she said, "We all just want civility," her eyes darted toward Jasmine's hair, her tone lowering with implication. Her words dripped with condescension. Her tone rehearsed like a performer craving applause. She wasn't debating, she was performing dominance. And yet, the harder she tried to project control, the more it slipped through her fingers. Crockett's silence began to unnerve her. There's something about calm that terrifies the insecure. Durmer's rhythm faltered. Her volume rose. "Maybe if you spent less time grandstanding and more time learning how things work around here." The murmurs grew. Staffers exchanged looks. Even her own allies shifted uneasily, sensing the edge in her voice. The room was tilting, the energy changing. But Durmer couldn't see it. She was too caught up in her own reflection, mistaking discomfort for victory. She leaned in closer, voice low, mock sympathetic. "It must be difficult being new here. I can imagine it's a learning curve." The patronizing tone hung in the air like static. The audience could feel it, that ugly, familiar sting of someone dressing up disrespect as guidance. Somewhere in the back, a journalist's pen paused mid-sentence. Cameras zoomed in. They knew what they were seeing. Not policy, not governance, performance art powered by ego. Durmer went on, layering her words with faux concern. "I respect passion, Congresswoman, but passion without discipline is chaos. Maybe if you'd take a page from those who've been here longer." That was the moment the shift began. The audience's body language changed. A few heads turned toward Crockett, anticipating her response. The sound of Durmer's own voice started to betray her, the pitch tightening, the rhythm losing sync. She'd mistaken the silence for submission. Crockett glanced up slowly, meeting Durmer's gaze for the first time. No anger, no smirk, just stillness. That small, quiet act made the entire room lean in. It was the calm that precedes a storm, the still surface of water before lightning strikes. Durmer noticed it too, though she didn't understand it. She mistook that calm for weakness, for the opening she'd been waiting for. "You know," she said, chuckling softly, "we all have to learn when to speak and when to listen." The irony went unnoticed by her, but not by the audience. The words hit the air and hung there, thick with hypocrisy. It was the kind of statement that plays well in sound bites but ages like spoiled milk. The camera caught the glint in Crockett's eyes, subtle, restrained, deliberate. The kind of look that says, "I've already won. You just don't know it yet." Durmer wrapped up her tirade with a final flourish. "Frankly, Congresswoman, we're tired of theatrics. Some of us still believe in respect, not reality television." And with that, she sat back, satisfied, convinced she'd landed her punch. The smugness was complete, the grin, the self-assured nod, the sideways glance to her aides, who responded with uncertain smiles. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of victory. It was the silence of something shifting an invisible current, reversing course. Durmer didn't realize it, but she'd done the one thing every good debater knows never to do. She'd overplayed her hand. Her arrogance had crossed from confidence into exposure, but Durmer had just handed Crockett all the ammunition she needed, and she didn't even know it yet. Long before the cameras, before the microphones and marble halls, Jasmine Crockett's fight began in rooms that smelled like ink, sweat, and determination. South Dallas, late nights, court filings stacked like walls around her, each page a story of someone silenced, someone dismissed. The flicker of a desk lamp was her only spotlight, and the hum of an old AC unit was the applause. She wasn't born into power. She earned her way into it, case by case, hour by hour, defending those who couldn't afford to be heard. In those cramped Texas courtrooms, she learned the rhythm of justice, the way truth moved slower than lies, but always landed harder. She faced judges who doubted her, opponents who mocked her accent, clients who'd already lost faith in the system. But Jasmine didn't bend. She turned every slight into fuel, every closed door into a reason to push harder. The law to her wasn't paperwork. It was purpose. Her mother used to tell her, "Baby, you don't have to shout to be strong. Just let your truth stand taller than their noise." That line stayed with her through law school, through her first campaign, through the countless times she was told she was too much or too passionate. Jasmine had learned early that what people called too much was often exactly enough. In her community, people still remember the way she'd show up unannounced to neighborhood meetings. No cameras, no headlines. She'd sit in the back, listen first, talk last. When she did speak, it wasn't with polish, it was with clarity. She knew what it meant to live the stories that others only read about in policy briefs. Rent hikes, evictions, over-policing, underfunding. She'd lived the statistics they liked to quote. There's a story her campaign manager tells the night before her first election, when the polls showed her trailing by 12 points. Everyone else was panicking. Jasmine just smiled and said, "They haven't heard me yet." The next morning, she walked into a town hall full of skeptics and walked out with a movement. It wasn't her resume that changed minds, it was her presence. She didn't try to outshout anyone. She out-honored them. By the time she reached Congress, she already knew the terrain. She'd seen how power spoke with confidence unearned, with arrogance unchallenged. But she also knew something else, that the truth, delivered calmly, could shake a system louder than 100 insults. She carried that lesson into every hearing, every exchange. Her staff joked that she had a steel pause, that moment of quiet she used before answering any attack. It wasn't hesitation. It was precision. It was the silence that came from knowing exactly who she was and where she came from. Behind her composure was a fire. No one could see the weight of every client she'd defended, every mother she'd comforted after an eviction, every teenager she'd told to keep believing in something better. That fire didn't burn to destroy. It burned to illuminate. But Washington wasn't built for her kind of calm. The town thrived on spectacle, on shouting matches dressed up as governance. They called her fiery when she disagreed and ungrateful when she refused to be patronized. She knew the coded language well. It was the same tone she'd faced in courtrooms, the subtle disbelief that someone like her could belong in a seat of power. Still, Jasmine never gave them the performance they wanted. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't take the bait. Every insult became a test of discipline, a quiet declaration that grace, when wielded right, is sharper than rage. Reporters began to notice it. Her clips circulated not for outbursts, but for precision, for the way she could dismantle an argument with a single line, for the way she turned mockery into moral gravity. "She doesn't raise her voice," one commentator said, "because the truth already echoes loud enough." That's why the moment in that hearing wasn't just a reaction, it was destiny arriving on schedule. The years of restraint, the courtroom composure, the fire disguised as grace they'd all been leading here. While Durmer smirked and sneered, Jasmine saw something else entirely. A familiar arrogance. She'd seen that face before in prosecutors who twisted facts, in landlords who smiled while evicting families, in politicians who called inequality policy. Every version of power that hid cruelty behind civility. And in that moment, she understood her role wasn't just to respond, it was to reveal. She remembered her mother's words again. Soft but steady, let your truth stand taller than their noise. So when Durmer finished her tirade, basking in her own echo, Jasmine didn't rush to speak. She let the air settle, let the arrogance linger long enough for everyone to taste it. Then she exhaled slowly, like someone who had carried this silence her whole life and finally decided to use it. The audience would remember that breath, the calm before her voice entered the record. Because this wasn't just another exchange between politicians. This was every courtroom where she'd been doubted, every debate where she'd been interrupted, every coded insult she'd ever turned into purpose, all converging in a single poised response. And she knew, deep down, that no matter how loud Durmer tried to be, truth didn't need volume. It only needed precision. So when Durmer took her shot, Crockett didn't flinch. She just leaned in and asked the first question. The silence that followed Durmer's outburst wasn't empty, it was electric. It pressed down on the room, thick enough to feel. And then, like the slow turning of a key in a lock, Jasmine Crockett leaned toward her microphone. Her tone was calm, her cadence deliberate. Her eyes steady, the voice of someone who'd walked into fire before and learned how to breathe through it. Congresswoman Durmer, she began. Soft but unmistakable. You mentioned accountability a moment ago. The word hung in the air, the very one Durmer had weaponized just minutes earlier. Crockett repeated it, slower this time, as though weighing it in her hand. Accountability. I just want to make sure I understand, does that include accountability for how our offices spend taxpayer dollars? The question was surgical, polite, but beneath its surface, it carried an edge so clean that it didn't draw blood immediately, it just left the room cold. Durmer blinked, caught slightly off guard. Of course, she said quickly, her smile tightening. Transparency is the cornerstone of democracy. Crockett nodded, her expression unreadable. I agree, which is why I'm curious, in your last quarterly report, there was an expenditure for a private consulting firm your campaign once employed. Can you clarify if that was taxpayer-funded? A flicker barely visible passed across Durmer's face. A smile forced, a laugh brittle. I'm not sure what you're implying, Congresswoman, she replied, her tone dipping into defensiveness. I'm not implying anything, Crockett said smoothly. I'm asking for accountability. The same standard you just outlined. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. The camera zoomed in on Durmer's face, catching the tension tightening around her jaw. On one of the committee screens, a live feed began circulating on social media. A tweet popped up in real time. Crockett just flipped it. Watch Durmer squirm. Durmer tried to recover. Well, I think it's inappropriate to bring up irrelevant matters. Crockett cut in gently but firmly. You brought up accountability, Congresswoman. I'm simply following your example. The room stirred a mix of stifled laughter and barely contained anticipation. Durmer's allies avoided eye contact. One aide leaned toward another, whispering. She walked right into it. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply waited. The silence became its own form of pressure. Durmer's voice wavered as she scrambled for footing. That's being reviewed, she said finally, the confidence bleeding from her tone. Crockett leaned back, just enough to signal ease, not retreat. Good, because accountability isn't selective, right? It's not a talking point. It's a responsibility. A flash of recognition crossed Durmer's eyes, the realization that she was no longer leading the exchange. Her carefully choreographed act of superiority was unraveling in real time. The performance lights she'd turned on herself were now illuminating every flaw. Cutaway. A journalist in the back of the room texting. She's losing it. Cutaway. A student live streaming from her phone whispering, Oh, she's good, Crockett's good. Cutaway. A tweet climbing past 50,000 views. Captioned, First question in the mask slips. Durmer straightened, forcing composure. You seem awfully interested in me, Congresswoman. Maybe focus on your own district before you... But Crockett didn't let her finish. Her voice remained level, almost too calm. I am focused on my district. That's why I care about accountability for all of us. She paused, then added, because the people who sent me here expect better than excuses. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy, but it landed like a thunderclap. The tension in the room broke into a low, nervous hum. Some faces turned toward Durmer, others toward the cameras, sensing the shift in momentum. The balance of power, invisible but unmistakable, had flipped. Durmer's smirk was gone now, replaced with something smaller, tighter, defensive. Her pen tapped against her folder in uneven rhythm. The air around her seemed thinner, heavier. She tried to glance down at her notes, but her hands shook just enough for the paper to tremble. Crockett didn't press further. She didn't need to. The silence after her words did the work for her. The first crack had appeared, and the audience could see it spreading a fracture in the facade of control. Somewhere, a camera light blinked red. The hearing's live-stream ticker spiked. Commentators would later say it was the moment the tone changed, when a single question, quiet, methodical, relentless, exposed everything bluster had tried to hide. But that was only the beginning, because question 2 hit even harder. If the first question cracked the facade, the second one began to pull it apart. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone slightly, a subtle motion, unhurried, deliberate. The kind of movement that says, I'm just getting started. The air in the room had shifted. A few members on the dais were now sitting straighter, sensing the energy turn. Staffers, once glued to their laptops, now pretended to type while their eyes flicked up to watch. The hum of whispered side comments, that low, nervous buzz of political instinct, filled the background. Everyone could feel it. Something was happening. Crockett didn't rush. She glanced at her notes, then looked back at Durmer. You know, she began, voice calm but firmer than before, when you talked earlier about professionalism, I couldn't help but think about the way we define it. She let the word linger, professionalism. Would you agree, Congresswoman, that professionalism should apply equally to all members of this body? Durmer gave a small, uneasy laugh. Well, of course. That's common sense, isn't it? Crockett nodded slowly, like a teacher waiting for a student to realize the question on the exam isn't as easy as it sounds. I ask because last month during that same committee meeting, one of your colleagues referred to a witness as emotional when she tried to describe her experience with discrimination. You didn't object then. In fact, you applauded. So I'm just curious, when exactly does professionalism apply, and to whom? A murmur rippled across the room. Heads turned. The press row came alive, pens scratching, thumbs flying over phones. Somewhere, a producer whispered, "Clip that." Durmer blinked hard. That's not relevant to today's discussion, she said quickly. But you just said professionalism applies equally, Crockett replied, tilting her head slightly. Surely it's relevant if it doesn't. The pause that followed was longer this time. Durmer's jaw tightened. She tried to recover. I don't recall every moment of that hearing. That's okay, Crockett said softly. I do. The line landed like a gavel. A few in the gallery stifled gasps. A faint sound of someone chuckling under their breath echoed from the back row. The tension in the air was now visible, thick, pulsing, cinematic. Durmer tried to pivot. Congresswoman, I'm not here to debate tone policing or emotional outbursts. I'm here to discuss fiscal oversight, and I respect that, Crockett interjected smoothly, her voice still unshaken. But when we're talking about oversight, it starts right here with how we treat the people we oversee. Because if we can't practice accountability with each other, how do we expect the country to trust us with theirs? For a moment, no one moved. It was too elegant to interrupt, too precise to deflect. Like a chess master, she saw 5 moves ahead, placing her words exactly where Durmer's defenses were weakest. The camera cut to Durmer's face. Her smile was gone. Her fingers clutched her pen like a lifeline. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Finally, she forced out, "You're twisting my words." Crockett leaned in slightly, not in aggression but in poise. No, Congresswoman. I'm repeating them. Word for word, the audience broke into low whispers. On one of the committee screens, a social media feed scrolled upward, live reactions pouring in. Crockett schooling her with kindness, this is how it's done. Tone, checkmate. Truth corner. She's exposing hypocrisy without even raising her voice. Durmer tried again, this time with a different strategy, denial cloaked in authority. I have decades of experience in public service. I've worked across the aisle. I've chaired. Crockett nodded, letting her speak, her face composed but her eyes sharp. When Durmer finished her self-congratulatory recitation, Jasmine smiled, small, genuine, disarming. That's impressive. So I'm sure with all that experience, you understand that leadership isn't just about titles. It's about consistency and integrity. Durmer hesitated. The compliment had turned into a corner. The line between praise and exposure blurred perfectly. Crockett continued, her tone steady as a surgeon's hand. So if we're going to talk about fiscal discipline and accountability, can we start by ensuring our language matches our values? Because when we weaponize civility against the very people who demand fairness, we stop being leaders and start being gatekeepers. The impact was immediate. The crowd reacted a hum of approval, restrained but undeniable. A clip of the exchange was already climbing the algorithm. Split-screen reactions, live captions, hashtags multiplying. Crockett vs. Durmer, her truth overtone, accountability in action. Durmer tried to interrupt, voice rising. Now hold on. But the interruption only highlighted the imbalance. Crockett stayed centered, hands folded, tone level. You spoke earlier about discipline, she said evenly. Let's practice it now. The audience broke into quiet laughter. Not mockery release, the kind that comes when truth finally punctures performance. Durmer's color rose slightly. This is exactly the kind of spectacle I was referring to, she said, her voice tight. Crockett met her gaze with surgical calm. Then perhaps, Congresswoman, we should stop giving people a spectacle to see. The words hit with the quiet force of inevitability. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even confrontation. It was revelation the moment the mirror turns. And the reflection is too honest to deny, a journalist whispered into her recorder. That's the sound of someone reclaiming the floor. Durmer shifted uncomfortably. I'm not here to be lectured by... Crockett interrupted again, not loudly, just clearly. By someone holding you to your own standard. The line sliced through the air, clean, surgical, devastating. The hearing room seemed to contract around them, the sound fading, the lights intensifying, the silence thickening until it felt like the whole country was watching in real time. Somewhere, a producer whispered, "This is the clip. This is the one." Durmer's deflection attempts grew frantic now. You're twisting this into something it's not, she insisted. You're making this personal. Crockett shook her head slowly. It's not personal. It's public, and that's what accountability looks like. The exchange had become something larger than a hearing. It was a moral confrontation wrapped in parliamentary formality, a clash between performance and purpose, between sound bites and substance. On the live stream, comments flooded in. She's unmasking her without breaking a sweat. This is how you hold power to account. No shouting. Just truth. And in the room, Durmer sat there exposed, cornered, visibly unraveling beneath the weight of her own contradictions. Crockett's voice softened. You see, Congresswoman, accountability isn't an attack. It's what we owe to the people who trust us to do this job. And when we dodge it, we fail them no matter how loud we talk about leadership. Durmer's eyes darted down to her papers. The performance had collapsed. What had begun as theater had become testimony against herself. Crockett leaned back, closing her folder with quiet finality. That's all I wanted to ask. For now. The words, for now, lingered like thunder in the distance, a warning, a promise. The crowd knew it. The reporters knew it. Even Durmer knew it, and as the buzz of whispers filled the chamber, the camera cut to Crockett, perfectly composed, her gaze steady and unbothered, the image of discipline in a world addicted to noise. And then came question 3, the one that ended it. By now, the hearing had turned into theater, but not the kind Durmer had scripted. The room was no longer hers. The performance lights she'd lit for herself now illuminated every fracture in her poise. Crockett sat across from her, still, centered, a quiet gravity pulling the room toward her. Every eye followed her every movement. Every breath she took was suspense. She adjusted her mic again, not nervously, but like a conductor preparing the final note of a symphony. Congresswoman Durmer, she began softly, her voice steady but edged with the faintest hint of something new, not anger, not triumph, but conviction. You've spoken a lot today about respect, about decorum, about knowing our place. Durmer straightened, forcing composure. That's right, she replied almost too quickly. And I stand by it. Crockett nodded. Good. Then I'd like to ask one last question. The room leaned in. Can you tell this committee right now the last time you publicly defended a woman of color who was being disrespected in this chamber? The words landed like a drop of ink in still water, quiet at first, but spreading fast. Durmer blinked. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Her lips parted slightly, as if an answer might appear if she waited long enough. But nothing came. 3 seconds. That's all it was. But it felt like a lifetime. The air was so still that even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Reporters froze mid-sentence. One aide coughed, too loudly, and immediately regretted it. The silence wasn't absence, it was revelation. Because in that gap, in those 3 unbearable seconds, every person in the room realized the truth. She had no answer. Crockett didn't move. She didn't look away. She just waited, and in doing so, she flipped the entire balance of power. The moment stretched, cinematic, almost surreal. Durmer's expression wavered from confidence to confusion to the dawning horror of someone realizing that their armor was built from words they never believed in. The camera zoomed in on her face. That forced smile tried to return, but it faltered halfway, collapsing into something raw, the first sign of vulnerability all day. She opened her mouth again, searching for something, anything to fill the void. Well, I treat everyone with... It was too late. The damage was done. The cracks were now chasms. The audience didn't need Crockett to say another word. The silence had said everything. In the press row, pens flew across paper. On phones across the country, live streams hit record. Tweets began flooding timelines in real time. She asked one question, just one. And the silence was louder than any answer. That pause just told America everything. Crockett didn't destroy her, she revealed her. Crockett's gaze softened, but her tone didn't waver. You see, Congresswoman, it's not about how loudly we preach respect. It's about when we choose to show it. She paused, letting the words breathe. And silence, in moments that matter, speaks volumes. Durmer tried to reclaim her footing. I don't think this line of questioning, Crockett interrupted, calm and final. Neither did the women who were interrupted, mocked, and dismissed in this very room. But they didn't get to choose the rules either. Her words weren't sharp. They were measured. And that made them even more devastating. The kind of truth that doesn't stab, it simply stands there, undeniable, until everyone else has to adjust around it. The room sat suspended in that realization. Even those who had come ready to defend Durmer avoided her eyes. Some shifted in their seats. Others stared down at their papers, suddenly fascinated by nothing. Crockett leaned back slightly, exhaling as if releasing the weight of years. I yield back my time, she said simply. No mic drop, no smile. Just dignity, and that was what made it unforgettable. The chair, clearly rattled, cleared his throat. The gentlewoman's time has expired. His voice wavered, betraying that even he felt the seismic shift that had just occurred. Durmer sat frozen for a beat longer than she should have, her pen motionless, her mask slipping completely. She nodded once, stiff, mechanical, then pretended to shuffle papers she wasn't reading. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett had already turned her gaze forward, eyes calm, jaw steady. To her, it wasn't about the takedown. It was about the truth landing in the open, where everyone could see it. For the viewers at home, that image would play over and over, the look of composure facing down arrogance, of quiet integrity dismantling loud hypocrisy. Clips hit Twitter before the hearing even adjourned. Slants was the answer, trended within minutes. Commentators called it the most devastating pause in congressional history, because it wasn't just a silence, it was a mirror, and every viewer could see exactly who they were in its reflection. Durmer avoided eye contact, scribbling notes that didn't exist. But everyone knew the hearing was over, not on paper, but in spirit. She'd been undone not by insult or outrage, but by her own inability to live the values she preached. Crockett's stillness became legend in that instant, the poise of someone who didn't just win an argument, but redefined what victory looked like. And as the gavel struck to move the session forward, a murmur rippled through the room, half awe, half disbelief. The kind of sound that says we just witnessed something, because they had. Jasmine Crockett hadn't shouted her truth. She'd made the truth so undeniable that the only thing left was silence. But outside that chamber, the real storm was just beginning. The gavel hit once, twice, and just like that, the hearing was over. But in truth, it had only just begun. Before the echoes of that final strike faded, the outside world was already catching fire. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's 3 questions flooded timelines faster than anyone in the chamber could leave their seats. Within minutes, the internet had found its new moment and its new hero. The first wave hit Twitter. Raw footage from the live stream, unedited, uncut, spread like lightning. A user with only a few hundred followers posted, "Watch Reverend Crockett dismantle Durmer with 3 questions. This is how you do it." 10,000 retweets in under an hour. Then came the hashtag Crockett clapback. Simple, sharp, undeniable. It trended within minutes, not because it was catchy, but because it captured what everyone felt, the pure satisfaction of seeing composure triumph over cruelty. TikTok followed. In one clip, a young creator layered slow-motion footage of Jasmine's silence over a pulsing cinematic soundtrack. Text across the screen read, 3 questions. 1 reckoning. Another video spliced Crockett's lines between moments of historical defiance, Rosa Parks refusing her seat, Shirley Chisholm taking the floor, Kamala Harris saying, "I'm speaking." Millions of likes poured in overnight. The algorithms weren't just feeding engagement, they were feeding catharsis. Cable networks jumped on it next. The Chiron read, "Congresswoman Crockett's viral moment, a new standard for grace under fire." Pundits dissected every pause, every inflection. "She didn't raise her voice once," one anchor marveled. That's the kind of restraint that terrifies bullies. By the evening, the late-night hosts had their opening monologues ready. One played the clip and said, "That's not a mic drop, that's a moral drop." The audience roared. Another quipped, "Durmer's silence lasted 3 seconds, but historians will study it for decades." Across social media, the reactions split along generational lines. Older commentators tried to downplay it. "Just another heated exchange," they insisted. But younger viewers weren't having it. They saw something different. Not politics, but poise. Not noise, but nuance. One college student's viral post said it best. "We grew up being told to be quiet." Jasmine showed us quiet can be power. Instagram flooded with art-stylized portraits of Crockett mid-question. Minimalist posters reading, "Ask better questions." Streetwear brands mocked up designs overnight. A simple black hoodie with white block text "Accountability" isn't an attack. They sold out by morning. The wave reached mainstream culture within 24 hours. Influencers quoted her. Musicians sampled her cadence. Activists invoked her silence as a new form of protest. On morning radio, a host joked, "People used to say drop the mic. Now they say drop the question." And yet, beneath the humor and memes, something more serious was unfolding, a collective exhale from those who had felt dismissed for far too long. Immigrants, women, young voters, people who'd learned to stay composed in the face of disrespect saw themselves in that moment. Jasmine's calm had become a mirror for their own restraint. Her questions an echo of everything they'd wanted to ask but never could. In living rooms across the country, families watched the replay like it was a sporting event. In classrooms, teachers paused lessons to talk about composure, truth, and courage. One high school civics teacher streamed the clip and said, This is how democracy self-corrects." Even some of Durmer's supporters began to waver. Conservative columnists tried to spin the narrative. Crockett was grandstanding, they argued, but their words rang hollow against the viral footage. The contrast was too clear, too visceral, arrogance unmasked by authenticity. Meanwhile, Jasmine stayed silent. No press conference, no interview circuit. Just a single post that read, "The truth doesn't need a microphone." It hit 5 million likes overnight. Commentators began calling it the Crockett effect, the idea that dignity, when displayed in public, can be louder than outrage. Cable roundtables debated it. Was this the start of a new political tone? Is intelligence finally trending again? Has grace become the new rebellion? For many, it felt like a cultural turning point, a reminder that in a world addicted to shouting, restraint could still be revolutionary. By week's end, the clip had surpassed 50 million views across platforms. Universities invited her to speak. Young voters organized panels around the theme, "Composure is Power." Celebrities tweeted support. Late-night comedians joked that Congress finally had an influencer worth following, but to those who understood, it wasn't about fame. It was about validation, the feeling of finally being seen. Jasmine's calm under fire had become a symbol, a language of defiance that didn't need to shout to be heard. One viral comment summed it up perfectly. Durmer spoke for 3 minutes and said nothing. Crockett said 3 sentences and changed everything. And through it all, Jasmine had one final message, a truth bigger than politics. The clip had already gone down in history, but for Jasmine Crockett, the moment that mattered most came long after the cameras stopped rolling. Days later, she sat down for an interview, no lights, no audience, just her and a microphone. The host asked the question everyone had been asking since that hearing. How did you stay so calm? Jasmine smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that had become her signature. Because the truth doesn't panic, she said. When you know who you are, they can't take that from you. Her voice was soft, but every syllable carried weight. She spoke not as a politician defending a viral moment, but as a woman reflecting on years of learning that strength and serenity aren't opposites, they're the same thing. People mistake silence for weakness, she continued. But sometimes silence is the only thing that cuts through all the noise. Clips from the interview would later circulate across social media, not because they were fiery, but because they were still. You could feel the authenticity in her pauses. She wasn't performing. She was teaching. I didn't stand my ground to win an argument, she said. I stood my ground because there are girls out there watching who've been told they're too loud, too emotional, too bold. And I wanted them to see that you can be calm and still command the room. Her words echoed across platforms. Commentators called it the Crockett Doctrine, a philosophy of dignity as resistance. She didn't lash out. She simply refused to shrink. And in doing so, she'd offered a blueprint for a different kind of power, one not built on dominance, but on self-respect. In classrooms, teachers replayed her interview during lessons about civic engagement. In barbershops and church basements, her lines became talking points. A young woman tweeted, "She made me realize I don't have to yell to be heard. I just have to know my worth." Another wrote, "Dignity is the loudest mic drop." But for Jasmine, it wasn't about the praise. In the quiet of her office, she looked out the window of the Capitol and thought about the people who never got a chance to speak, the single mothers, the activists, the community leaders who fought without recognition. She knew her moment had become symbolic, but symbols only mattered if they led to change. That's why, in her next address, she went beyond the viral soundbite. Standing before a packed town hall, she didn't mention the hearing at all. Instead, she spoke about the culture that made moments like that necessary, about the deep hunger for dignity in a world addicted to division. Dignity, she said, isn't something you wait to be given. It's something you decide to keep. The crowd went silent, not out of awe, but out of understanding. They knew exactly what she meant. Every person who'd ever been talked over, underestimated, dismissed, they felt that sentence land. She told them that true courage isn't in shouting louder. It's in standing taller. That grace under pressure isn't submission, it's strategy. There's power in refusing to match disrespect with disrespect, she said. Because when you stay composed, you don't just win the moment, you redefine the standard. By the time she finished, the room was on its feet. Not the roaring kind of applause that fades in seconds, but the steady rising kind that feels like a heartbeat, unified, hopeful, enduring. In that moment, it wasn't about partisanship or even politics. It was about something older, deeper, the timeless idea that integrity can still triumph over arrogance, that truth can still outlast noise. As she stepped down from the stage, cameras flashing once more, she turned to an aide and said quietly, "It's not about proving them wrong. It's about proving us right." And somewhere, across millions of screens, those words took root. People who'd felt invisible suddenly felt seen. People who'd been quiet suddenly felt powerful. Because what Jasmine Crockett had shown wasn't just how to win a debate, it was how to win without losing yourself. But she wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning of a much bigger story. It began as just another hearing, another clash in the endless storm of politics. But when Lorie Chavez Durmer attacked Jasmine Crockett, she didn't realize she was lighting a fuse that would illuminate the truth. 3 questions, that's all it took. 3 precise, unshaken, undeniable questions that turned arrogance into silence and silence into revelation. Because when arrogance attacks truth, truth doesn't shout. It asks the right questions. That's what this story was always about. Not party lines, not viral fame, but dignity. The power of composure in a world that rewards chaos. The courage to stay calm when provoked. the intelligence to know that silence can roar louder than any insult. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a moment. She reminded millions that self-respect is still strength, that grace is still power, that the people who try to humiliate others will always end up revealing themselves instead, and maybe that's why this moment struck such a chord, because deep down, we all want to believe that calm courage can still change the temperature of the room, that intellect can still defeat intimidation, that truth, when delivered with dignity, still stands taller than lies. So if you believe in that, if you believe that calm courage beats chaos, share this story. Share it for every person who's been talked over, dismissed, or underestimated. Share it, because one act of composure can ripple through millions. Because in a time when noise dominates everything, Jasmine Crockett proved something timeless. You don't have to shout to shake the room. You just have to stand firm and ask the right questions.